Welcome to Historical Drama with the Boston Sisters, where we talk about historical drama series and films as windows to the past and mirrors of the present. I'm Michon Boston.
And I'm Tequina Boston. This is Revolution to Rights America at 250, a 10-episode podcast series from Historical Drama with the Boston Sisters. Revolution to Rights takes you on a journey through America's 250-year history of advancing freedom and justice since the Declaration of Independence in 1776.
The historical dramas featured in Revolution to Rights tell stories of battles fought in the quest for freedom and the people whose collective actions and courage inspire us to move beyond remembrance and to take actions today to ensure freedom and justice for all.
The American Revolution ignited a worldwide rebellion where people imagined a government without monarchs and with chosen representation, which they labeled a republic. For a long time, America's Declaration of Independence and Revolution story was dominated by rebellious acts, great battles, and lofty declarations signed by quote-unquote founding fathers. Historians Cassandra Good and Sara Georgini have used their scholarship to document the revolutions in the domestic and personal spaces between women and men, as revealed through friendship and correspondence. This podcast talks about how a new nation was igniting changes in roles and expectations for men and women, as well as the social contract between the governing and the governed. Their research and writing tell stories about women's influence in the making of a new nation and how their personal relationships with founders through companionate marriages and mid-sex friendships gave women political agency via social and domestic spaces.
We chose the 2008 HBO series John Adams to explore this historical backdrop about one of America's founding families. John Adams won 13 Emmy Awards, including Outstanding Miniseries, Writing, Directing, Costumes, Art Direction, Casting, Lead Actor, and Lead Actress for a miniseries or movie. Based on David McCullough's Pulitzer Prize-winning biography of the second President of the United States, the miniseries John Adams depicts the extraordinary life journey of one of the primary shapers of America's independence and government. Fiercely independent, brilliant, and brutally honest, John Adams is one of America's least understood and most underestimated founders. The series features Paul Giamatti in the title role and Laura Linney as Adams' wife Abigail, an intelligent, wise, and resourceful confidant. From their domestic and personal space, friendship, and correspondence, John and Abigail Adams laid the foundation for the founding of a new nation.
We begin our conversation about John and Abigail Adams and women's influence through friendship and correspondence in the making of a new nation, starting with Cassandra Good. Cassandra Good is a writer and historian specializing in politics, gender, and culture in early America. She is an associate professor at Marymount University with a PhD from the University of Pennsylvania. She's the author of 2 books, Founding Friendships, Friendships Between Men and Women in the Early American Republic, published by Oxford University Press, and First Family, George Washington's Heirs and the Making of America, a finalist for the 2024 George Washington Prize. Her work has been supported by the National Endowment for the Humanities, the Smithsonian Institution, and Mount Vernon.
Our second guest is Sara Georgini. Sara Georgini is series editor for the Papers of John Adams, part of the Adams Papers editorial project based at the Massachusetts Historical Society, where she has worked for nearly 2 decades. She is the author of Household Gods, The Religious Lives of the Adams Family, published by Oxford University Press, and the forthcoming Our Library in Paris, as well as editor of the Oxford Handbook of Family History and Genealogy and co-editor of Americans in Revolution, New Intellectual Histories. As a historical editor, she publishes authoritative editions of the founders' words, leads student and teacher workshops, curates manuscripts and artifacts in thematic exhibits, and brings Adams' expertise spanning 3 centuries to broad audiences in person and online. Welcome, Cassandra and Sara, to Historical Drama with the Boston Sisters.
Thanks so much for having us.
Thanks for having us. We're glad to be here.
Cassandra, we're going to start with you. What inspired you to write about mixed-sex friendships as one of the changes spurred by the American Revolution? How is mixed sex defined in this context?
Yeah, the word mixed sex might sound a little bit strange. Male, female would be another way to put it, or the sort of technical term is heterosocial, but that is, again, very academic-y sounding. So in a sense, mixed sex became the easiest way to talk about it. The other term people might know is platonic. People often refer to friendships between men and women now as platonic. I didn't use that word because it meant something slightly different in the late 18th and early 19th century. It meant romantic but not consummated. And the idea that I was looking at here was friendships that were not explicitly romantic. And I came at this really from experiences, I would say, in college more than anything. From having had a lot of male friends in college and then throughout my life, but then also reading the papers of a woman named Margaret Bayard Smith. And she wrote about saying goodbye to Thomas Jefferson before he left the White House and returned to Monticello. This is 1809. And she writes in this letter about how emotional that was and how hard it was to say goodbye to him. And I remember her telling my advisor, like, oh, I think I might have discovered an affair. And she said, no. And this was a published source. It had been published since like 1901. And she said, people spoke about emotions differently then and spoke about relationships differently. So it was probably a friendship. And I thought, oh, that's hard enough to have work out now. How did that work in the past? And that really became the driving question. And really, I would talk to people and talk to archivists or other scholars and say, do you know of examples of this? And they say, no, I don't think that happened. But every archive I went to, I found correspondence between men and women who were friends with each other. All of the early presidents had female friends. And so fortunately, that early advisor's comment turned out to be right, that actually, yes, there are these friendships between men and women that exist. And, they existed before the revolution, they exist after, but they take on a special tenor in this founding period during a time where women also have a special sort of political and social role.
And Sara, how did you come to work with the Adams family? And I don't mean Gomez, so we're talking about John. Yes, so snap out fingers. John and Abigail Adams family papers and their descendants at the Massachusetts Historical Society.
So I had an interesting journey into public history while I was pursuing my doctorate, and I was lucky to be working here as a library assistant at the Massachusetts Historical Society. I noticed as I ran the front desk and buzzed people in that what they most often wanted to see was a real letter between John and Abigail Adams. Could we possibly show it to them that day? And so I started to think about all the ways we can make that happen. The Adams Papers editorial project makes those primary sources freely available through our letterpress volumes and our free Adams Papers digital editions that are sourced from what really is the Adams Presidential Library here at the MHS. 250,000 manuscript pages, over 10 generations worth of American experience at the heart of the collection. I know it's a wow moment, right? It really is. My job is a lot like National Treasure. I get to work with original manuscripts all day and protect them, but also preserve and share them. I have to say that coming to the Adams family story was a surprise for me as an early Americanist. Growing up in Brooklyn, New York, and going to public school there, when we got to the American Revolution classes, the Adamses were never front and center as stars. They are New England rock stars, but really not too far beyond that. So it was a real education for me reading their letters, and understanding how they prioritized public service, what they thought that moment of creation for the new nation could be, and then how they really struggled with one plot twist after another in their personal and professional lives to make it happen. So I started reading the Adams papers for work here almost 20 years ago. I obviously have a ways to go. But I'm in the John Adams presidency right now, and it's been really illuminating to kind of see what's resonant with today's news, to understand kind of the sacrifices that they made, and to really take advantage of that backstage pass to American history that these letters offer us.
Well, it's interesting, Sarah, because more and more we're understanding those kinds of private resources, letters, diaries. I guess for our own time, it'll probably be emails and texts, et cetera. But they give us a real sense of the backstory of history. They take us beyond, date, person, event. This is what happened, to give us some real insights into what life was like for people living in those times. As you've gone through the Adams papers, what do they reveal about the impact of the American Revolution on the lives of women in that early American history? And we are emphasizing women because often so much of women's history, particularly around the American Revolution, has been left out. And we're just beginning to get some kind of insight into what it was like for the women during the American Revolution.
Sure. So women make great revolutionaries, right? Deeply suspicious of power and corruption at home and abroad for centuries before the American Revolution rolls up on their doorstep. With Abigail, we have an extremely eloquent political thinker. We have someone who finds ways to contribute to that sphere without voting in an age of coverture, which I know that Cassie can tell us more about. We have someone who is embedded in really decades long political networks that are knit together by family and friends in New England. So she's good at gathering information, sharing intelligence, acquiring more. She is also running a home with several small children that is embroiled in war as it just comes closer and closer, the conflict. So she is someone who is at the center of kind of American political life, even though she doesn't vote. And she maintains that stature, somewhat to her husband's detriment later on. So I think the question of how women are impacted by the revolution is a good one, but it's a two-way street. Women are shaping this revolution too. They are very much full participants in it, as we hear from Abigail herself. What's extraordinary about Abigail is that she left us an archive. So there is still a great deal of work to be done looking for women's words and ideas. And often they're kind of subsumed in these vast library collections of family papers. And while perhaps the spotlight has been on their husbands, it's time for us to shift it to them.
Amen.
Well, and I should mention with that sometimes the challenge with finding women is that the papers collections will be named, such and such man, family papers, or just the last name and family papers, or sometimes just the man's name, papers. And then you look, and you have to look if there's a good finding aid, as sort of guide to what is in that collection. And you have to read through that and see where women's writings might be. They might or might not be completely identified in there. Sometimes, especially in older guides, and frankly, when you go to an art museum and see portraits, you're seeing Mrs. Man's name. So you don't even get the woman's name in her own right. So there are still challenges to actually finding women in the archive.
I want to add one more point to that. When we were curating our 1776 exhibit, we really tried to remember the ladies in every room, to think about women as political actors. And that meant that we wanted to show them doing the same kind of intellectual work that the men did in trying to pull together high-flying Enlightenment ideals of equality and liberty with realities like economic inequality or slavery on the ground. And so we thought about how to present the full political spectrum of women's views, whether they were loyalists, whether they were patriots, whether they were neutral, not to just easily slot them into the bucket of triumphant heroine. right? Like these are women who are really struggling through reading and writing their way through a revolution that no one fully saw coming. And the nation that comes after that is so freighted with all of these promises for women, which aren't fully realized, perhaps even today.
Cassandra, your book, Founding Friendships, raises a question. I think we've heard this question before. Can women and men be friends? And that's it's mostly associated with the familiar American rom-com When Harry Met Sally. Your book speaks of companionate marriages. Did I say that correct?
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Um, and Also the distinct types of relationships between women and men. What made them different from each other, particularly with regard to women's social and political position in the early American Republic, as you call it in your book?
Yeah, and this really connects to the last point that Sarah ended on about this promise for women after the revolution and these new early American, we call it small R Republican, like not like the political party, but republicanism, like a political system, values where there was a strong value on virtue, on equality, on freedom. And marriages actually can't meet those standards at this point because companionate marriage, which means marriage based in friendship, you would think, okay, that means that men and women are on fairly equal footing in this relationship. But in fact, because of coverture, which Sarah mentioned earlier, this legal system where when a woman gets married, she essentially loses her legal identity. She is covered by the husband. And the husband has pretty extensive legal control over her property, and her body. So even if there's a marriage, that this is the period where we start seeing marriage based more on love and not purely as an economic relationship or a deal between men, basically. Marriage was not based on romantic love a lot of the time before this. It increasingly is supposed to be based on that and between a friendship between the men and women. But even when that's the case, even in a good marriage, you can't be equal when the husband has that legal power over you. He can choose not to exercise it. And then, this issue of freedom, too, once you were married in that period, it was not easy to get divorced. There were states that started allowing divorce. In many places, you had to get an act of the legislature to get divorced. And that could only happen if, the one partner ran away with somebody else, there was adultery. So essentially, once you were married, you were no longer free to leave that relationship. And, there's some discussion with friendships between men and women that husbands basically had a veto power over who a woman who his wife was friends with. And so we see married women who have male friends making sure to include their husbands. Husbands don't necessarily have to include their wives, but the husband of a wife in a friendship with another man needs to sort of be part of it to keep up certain appearances, make it clear that this is, above board and it is proper. But on the other hand, a friendship between a man and a woman didn't have those same legal problems that a marriage did. So you could end a friendship whenever you wanted. Abigail Adams cut off Thomas Jefferson and stayed enemies with him for much longer than John did. And John Adams cut off friendships. And these were cutting off friendships in part due to politics. So you see that, there is more freedom there. And there is also, there's some constraint in terms of incorporating the husband. But at any in American society, a man and a woman could not be legally equal. But within a friendship, there's more equality between a man and a woman than in probably any other relationship between men and women at this time. You see in these friendships that women are able to push back when a male friend is telling them what to do. And they do push back and say, like, hey, no, I'm not going to take that from you. And, sometimes you see men saying back, like, oh, I'm really sorry. And it's a different dynamic. It's a freer dynamic.
Yeah. Cassandra, I was particularly interested in the chapter in your book where you talk about the power of friendship. And, Sara made reference to this as well, that this wasn't a time where women had the kind of political power that, we associate with politics today. In fact, they couldn't vote, they couldn't serve on juries, they couldn't run for political office. But when you were on the panel at the Institute for Politics, Policy, and History earlier this year, their panel on women of valor, you talked about women actually exercising agency, particularly women who were in what was the new nation's capital, Washington City, not Washington, D.C. So, based on that time, how are you defining agency for women, and where were they exercising that agency, and who had access to that kind of political power and influence?
Yeah, agency is a sort of historical term of art that historians use differently from, I think, how the general public would use agency. And it especially began with people trying to understand how enslaved people and Native people could be independent historical actors and not just people acted upon, and then looking at women too. So agency is the capacity to act for oneself, to make change oneself, to make independent decisions. And, agency can be a small thing. Just because somebody has agency doesn't mean that they are not also being oppressed, which is what gets a little bit tricky about it. And so I would say that, yes, women do have some political agency in this period. They are also politically discriminated against, disadvantaged at the same time. They certainly don't have as much power as men. But we also have to keep the sort of class dimension here in mind, because coming out of the revolution, only wealthy people or people who owned some land could vote in most states. Head of household is the person who gets to vote. So if you are a man living in another man's household, you still don't get to vote. So it's not just women who are being singled out. The whole sort of British basis of voting was based on property ownership. And that only gets loosened over time, state by state in America, because the Constitution does not have a blanket right to vote. And it leaves it up to the states to decide on qualifications. And there is one state in New Jersey where widowed women, so these are women who can own property, or single women, again, they can own property. If they own property, they actually can vote for about a 20-year span in the state of New Jersey. Abigail Adams knows about this. I think probably a lot of women in America were aware of it, but it was sort of a quirk or exception. It did not last very long. And, we're not going to see women actually getting the vote for a very long time after this. So what can they do in the meantime? Plenty of women are not even asking for the vote at this point, because again, that seems so radical to them. They are figuring out avenues to power wherever they can. So it might be through a spouse who is a politician, so Abigail through John. It might be through a male friend. Abigail Adams is doing politicking through her friendship with Thomas Jefferson. And influence and information is going both ways between them about politics. And particularly in this founding era, there's a lot of personal politicking. Congress only sits for a few hours a day, a few months a year. So the politicking that's happening is happening in private homes, at dinners, at teas, and those have men and women at them. And so they're discussing those things. So that's a sort of informal kind of power. Women also have a right to petition. This is a longstanding British right, but women very much use this right, especially when we get to anti-slavery and suffrage campaigns. And then when we get to a little bit later period, when political campaigning really starts in the 1840s, we don't have people campaigning for president exactly. That was considered inappropriate. You weren't supposed to actually want the office. So they're directing things behind the scenes, but they're not going out giving stump speeches. You start seeing that happen in the 1840s, and women are at those stump speeches. They are at campaign rallies. They're going to all these campaign events. And the politicians at these events are saying, to the women in the audience, make sure that your son, your father, your husband, your male friends vote for our party. And so there is this sense that's not just an ask. They know that women are influencing the votes of the men in their lives to the extent that you see newspaper articles about women who refuse to marry somebody from the opposite party or who voted for a particular candidate. And so, again, this is an indirect influence, but it's still an important one.
And it's sounding rather familiar given our times and the political divisions we're seeing.
Can I add something to this question of agency?
Yeah.
Because there's the double edge of agency for someone like Abigail is ambition. And this is not a positive word for women in this period. And so thinking of kind of a few quick examples that illustrate in Abigail's life, Cassie's points about how women mine these loopholes, how they find ways around a system that is not built for them, a way through. Abigail, during the Revolutionary War, buys and sells European goods in essentially running a black market operation. John Adams is funneling her satins and laces, thanks to his diplomatic credentials, and sending them on ships. She notices that at one point he kind of gets cold feet about all of this. And she says, well, if 2 out of 3 ships make it, then I will be a gainer. Like, stick it out. Like, we need the money for our family. So she finds a way to be a buyer, a seller, an influencer on a local scale. When she serves as First Lady, still then not quite the name of the job yet, that'll happen in the 19th century, but still unpaid, undefined. She serves as John Adams' kind of one-woman cabinet and plants political essays defending his administration in the press. She knows how to run the optics in the new White House, which is pretty impressive. And then finally, I think her will gives us an interesting primary source document of Turning the Tide, where she front loads all the women who she thinks should be heirs to anything she owns, which is not really what the legal scholars and practices were telling her to do. So in these 3 kind of turning points in her life, she finds ways around and through the system. However, she pays mightily for it. She is often dragged in the press on 2 continents as being kind of luxury loving. At one point, she is often referred to during John Adams' presidency as the old woman in the newspapers, although she's barely 50. And people think that John Adams perhaps would have made different steps in his foreign policy if the old woman had been there to advise him. So that's a hard thing for her to read in the press, surely. She is tagged always as being someone who is ambitious to not just support her husband, but to create a political dynasty that might rival the courts of Europe, with her very promising eldest son, John Quincy, that she is kind of the pushy stage mom who gets him into the political arena. And this is repeated through a lot of biographies for a lot of years. This idea that she always wants to put the family first and shove them into the spotlight. She has heard this in her own lifetime, and she even says, my ambition is not to be first in Rome. So there's a moment here where women have agency, but they are grappling very much with the optics of it.
That's fascinating, too, that she had a little bit of an underground business going as well. We don't assess, well, I don't know, we might be
side hustle. It's called a side hustle.
It's some of the things we're seeing today in politics. But I'm really interested, Sara. You were talking about how she was characterized. And one of the things, because we use historical dramas to, kind of as a portal for people to get interested in the history behind the drama. So in the John Adams series, based on David McCullough's biography of Adams, we see this relationship between a husband and wife. I guess this would be the companionate marriage, based in friendship, and there's also romance. But Abigail is depicted as an advisor to her husband. She's not just the supportive spouse. What have you found in their papers that support that characterization, or is there an aspect of it that's missing that you wish that they had included based on the research and the papers you're working with?
Well, I have to say, first of all, knowing how hard David McCullough worked to source that biography from the Adams papers here, and then watching the miniseries, I'm such an unabashed fan of it because I know there are things where it goes a little Hollywood, where it's not quite how things happened. But I think it really captures their marriage well, the political arena well. I think it does a good job of carrying you from the personal to the political and back again. What it evokes, I think, very well is the kitchen table conversations, right? That don't quite make it into the 250,000 manuscript pages. So you really do get a sense of kind of what their back and forth is like. There's an example that stands out to me, which is something I'm asked about a lot from the miniseries, which is Abigail at the end of a very long day. There's a scene where she is editing his closing arguments for the Boston Massacre trial. And she says, strip out quoting all the other great guys. We know you're a great guy. We can see you're learned, but strip it out. And I don't have any archival evidence that that happened, but wow, it sure seems like it could have, because they certainly have kind of a shared language. Abigail is very much self-educated. She has kind of by happenstance here and there picked up some of the same Harvard education that her husband has, but in no way, she doesn't have the legal training, but she has the legal acumen. She has the instinct. She knows how to argue. We get their kind of rich, complex back and forth dialogues in the letters, north of about 1,200 that are shared between them in the course of their lifetime. So I would believe that she edited and read his pieces, and I would believe that he listened to her. I mean, when we see kind of the closing arguments, which, if you go to our legal papers, are kind of pulled together from literally scraps of paper from multiple archives. They're kind of the legal papers themselves, that very famous closing argument with stats, facts are stubborn things. That's all kind of pulled together from just a palimpsest of different notes that we had. It's the legal papers are pretty much if you took John Adams out of the courtroom on a random Thursday, turned him upside down, and whatever fell out of his pockets, we kind of pieced together. So I think that you do see to a great degree their back and forth really well reflected in the miniseries. And the marriage is just, I mean, it is a union of intellectual equals as much as it can be in that period. And I think you see that very much reflected in their favorite phrase for each other, right? My dearest friend. That very famous opening, I think, to that Remember the Ladies letter on March 31st, 1776 shows that too. I wish you would ever write me a letter half as long as I write you. Well, you're in it. You kind of get the tone immediately of their marriage. But Cassie, what do you think? What do you think about the marriage and how it's reflected? I'm curious because of your work on companionate marriage, how that comes to life on screen.
Yeah. Part of what I think about with that series is that, and Sarah and I disagree about this, I find John Adams insufferable in his letters, and I find him insufferable in the TV show. It's hard because, he and Abigail Adams were both friends with this woman, Mercy Otis Warren, and her husband, James Warren, but mostly Mercy Otis Warren. And when Mercy Otis Warren publishes a book about the history of the Revolution, right after the Revolution, one of the first books about it, it's around 10 years after, less than 20. And she's critical of John Adams in it. She disagrees with him on a lot of things politically. And he writes her really nasty letters. I mean, these are just mean-spirited over and over. It's not just one letter. It is a bunch of letters just being really mean. And after I read those, I was like, this guy, he is just, and I think you do get a sense from the TV show that he's a little difficult, and Abigail Adams puts up with that and is, in some ways more charming than he is. And so I think, that is a good reflection there. And it is hard for us to imagine what a marriage would look like when a husband had that level of legal control over a woman, and yet they're also trying to treat each other as equals. Like, how does that actually play out on the ground? And in some sense, we can't fully know.
Well, he's just not there a lot, right? I mean, he kind of checks out to deal with independence at the Continental Congress, and then he's gone to Europe. So she is basically on her own. Like there's a form of independence that she has to kind of create for herself. I do think that the series is exquisitely cast. Like I am a big fan of Paul Giamatti and Laura Linney in these roles because you get the sense, I think, from Giamatti of who Adams is. He's candid, he's colorful. He is a prickly little guy who absolutely itches if anyone else is in the spotlight. We see that with Franklin certainly too. And Abigail, I think she has more layers than you expect in the series. She's not just cast in like the last time you met her in March in third grade for Women's History Month. Like she has a little more depth to her in terms of moving between the grime of colonial New England politics and the sumptuous courts of Europe. And you see how she is really struggling to kind of make that leap. I think that's really interesting. There's a moment where both of them have to become more cosmopolitan kind of overnight, and they really struggle. So I really enjoy these two in their roles, and I think the fuller cast, like the wider cast, is so thoughtfully created. I mean, there's some people who, when you read the papers, you kind of like keep an eye out, like, oh, who'd they pick for this one? You know, and someone like his son-in-law, William Stephen Smith, who's a bit of a ne'er-do-well. He's kind of a bad boyfriend and a worse husband all around to John and Abigail's daughter, Nabby. I was like, oh, Andrew Scott, brilliant. Like, this is someone who is just slippery enough that I think, you kind of want to watch him come and go. There's so many supporting characters in the Adamses universe of experience. They kind of meet so many people and go to so many places and do so many things that I'm always intrigued when someone can pull it off in like 7 or 8 hours. That's actually not that easy to do.
No, it's for sure.
Yeah, we'll be transitioning from John Adams to Franklin. So there's a lot of overlap that we're going to have between these two podcasts.
That's a great series. I really enjoyed the Franklin series too.
Well, and Franklin certainly had a lot of interesting relationships with women, ranging from friendships to
everything
romances
else.
to we're not sure what was going on. So yeah, Franklin is quite an interesting figure.
You've been enjoying Historical Drama with the Boston Sisters, a podcast where we talk about historical drama films and series as windows to the past and mirrors of the present.
Make sure you subscribe to our podcast on your favorite platform. Share the excitement with your friends. Visit MichonBostonGroup.com/Boston Sisters. Join the historical drama community by signing up for our e-newsletter so you'll never miss an update, future episodes, or exclusive bonus content.
Now, back to our fascinating conversation.
Well, let's go back to the friendships again, especially between Abigail and her BFFs, her male BFFs. So both of you can probably address this question. What influence did she have through her friendships? We talked about, she could plant some seeds there in terms of policy and politics, including Thomas Jefferson. I want to know, maybe this is the question, how did they become friends? What was the nature of their friendship? And why did it blow up? I mean, when did she cancel Thomas Jefferson? Because we do see some indication of their friendship coming together in the series. They're not showing any letters in the series, but I get the feeling they're interpreting the letters visually. So let's talk about Thomas Jefferson and if there are other BFFs in Abigail Adams' life.
Yeah, I mean, Thomas Jefferson was not her first male friend. Certainly with John Adams gone for many years during the Revolution, she has several other male friends in Massachusetts. I think one, James Lovell, is really interesting because they don't actually hang out in person almost at all. If it maybe one, I don't know, Sarah might know, but I think rarely, if ever. It's really a correspondence in letters. He's in Philadelphia at the Continental Congress, and so he's able to get her information. And so she values that, but he's also clearly flirting with her. And, whether he ever intends for it to be anything more than that, who knows? But he is definitely flirting with her. She just sort of ignores that for the most part. I think you see this in other friendships, even if you look at Alexander Hamilton, who flirts with every woman he comes across. And often the women just kind of ignore it, or they might write a little playfully back. I mean, Franklin does this kind of thing too. And it's interesting with these letters because Abigail does say at some point, like, somebody could intercept this letter and this would not look good the way you're talking to me. And there's not a secure mail service at this point, especially when she's writing overseas. Because the way you get a letter to somebody abroad is you hand it to somebody who's going on a ship, and or maybe somebody who knows somebody going on a ship. They carry it across the ocean, then they hand it to somebody when they get to London or Paris, and then it gets handed along to the person it was sent to. So this is not a secure process. People could remove a wax seal and put it back on without fully tampering with the letter. So, I mean, this is why a lot of the diplomatic correspondence between Europe and America at this point is written in code. The State Department had a set of numeric codes, which fortunately we have the keys. Like, these are all decodable. But Abigail does have to think about that in these friendships. What does this look like? I know I'm a public figure. If people see this, it's going to make the newspapers. So yeah, she does have that sort of interesting friendship. And then she knows that John Adams has been friends with Jefferson for a while. And then they meet in Paris and then keep up a correspondence in letters when the Adams move on to London. And so that's really where we get a lot of the letters between them and where they have a pretty strong friendship. And there are times, Jefferson is writing to John and Abigail on the same day. And there's a letter where he says, I'm not getting the information I want from John. Can you fill me in on what is going on? And then the sort of converse of that is that Jefferson is doing what we think of today as stereotypically female tasks, like shopping for things for Abigail in Paris, because the stuff is nicer in Paris. So they have this pretty long friendship. She stays on okay terms with him longer than John Adams, but it's really the 1796 presidential election where they're running against each other, and there's nasty comments on both sides, and Abigail felt that they crossed a line. And that's what she later says. She says in a letter to Jefferson, she's writing after his daughter dies to write a letter of condolence, but says, like, look, I lost respect for you after you did this. She's, that direct about it. So it then, was a fairly long break in their friendship. Benjamin Rush steps in and later repairs the Thomas Jefferson-John Adams relationship. But it's another few years before Abigail Adams writes with Jefferson again. And I don't know, Sarah may have other details to add to that.
So, I mean, when Adams and Jefferson meet at the Continental Congress, they kind of find their roles. Adams is the talker, Jefferson is the writer, and this works really well to have a sign of Massachusetts, Virginia consensus on this unlikely bid for independence. When Thomas Jefferson comes to France, he is newly a widower, and Abigail kind of takes him in. He's kind of the favorite uncle who shows up. And helps with, John Quincy and others. It's a wild kind of house to imagine in Passy with Jefferson and Franklin, little JQA. It must have been amazing to kind of sit in the garden and have some of those conversations. We see some of that come to life, I think, a little bit in the miniseries. But Jefferson and Abigail really have a lot of fun in Paris as first-time Americans who've always read about it but never done it. They kind of embrace the tourist lifestyle. And they go to Notre Dame, Abigail's first experience really hearing and seeing a Catholic Mass. They go to concerts. They go to orphanages. They go look at, museums and libraries. They really go everywhere and take full advantage of this moment abroad. Abigail had grown up in Weymouth, so here in the country outside Boston, far from the metropolis, as a prominent clergyman's daughter. She never thought she would be presented to kings and queens. Jefferson perhaps is a little more familiar from his Virginia gentry days of how to operate in kind of aristocratic circles. So they kind of are two fish out of water who find each other in France and befriend each other. As Cassie said they do shop for each other. Once Abigail is setting up the American legation, so the embassy in London in Grosvenor Square, where her husband John Adams will entertain fellow diplomats, she realizes quickly that she needs to entertain a lot of people on no money. So she turns to Jefferson to kind of help kit out or outfit and decorate kind of the legation with really beautiful statues and artwork and things like that. In return, we know from the kind of bill of expenses that they send back and forth that we have here in the Adams papers that he outshops her, but she outsmarts him when it comes to what she needs. And what she sends him are the kinds of things that perhaps, she would send to a widower friend. She's sending him things like linens and vests and, jackets and buttons, things that are practical that he will need that he is not thinking about. And so he sends back to her things like silk stockings for her daughter, Nabby. It's a very kind of intimate friendship in that way of knowing what people need from each other. They do grow apart, exactly as Cassie says, due to kind of party politics. And when she does reach out after the death of his daughter, she clearly has loaded her pen with plenty of political invective. So what starts out as kind of a note of condolence becomes this very awkward back and forth of two people who were good friends, who have been pulled apart by party politics and really cannot find a way back to each other. They have maybe one last exchange much later on, but they never really rekindle the friendship as her husband and Thomas Jefferson are able to do. It's just not something that she can handle. The thing about Abigail is that she is steely to the point of flinty. You can meet her as a strong woman on the page and in person, but at some point those walls are fully up. And I think that's something that's really interesting to think about, what these friendships show us about these very famous revolutionary characters. We think we know their portraits so well, but I mean, talk to their friends, right? If you want the full story.
Jefferson, too, obviously an extremely complicated person,
Mhm.
but we know from his female friends, very good at talking to women. He was soft-spoken, he was sensitive, he had similar interests, he would talk to them as intellectual equals, and yet he writes even to some women, women shouldn't wrinkle their foreheads with politics. He says these blatant things that women shouldn't be talking about politics. Women should be home being mothers. And then there's what he actually does. So, as so often with Jefferson, there's what he says and then what he does. And what he does is have a ton of female friends who he talks about politics with. I think there's certain women that he thinks it's okay to discuss politics with and others that he'd rather not. But I think the other thing to point out here is that it's possible for people to have intellectual and even emotional intimacy without having a physical, intimate relationship. On the other hand, I think that there were friendships between men and women from this period that probably did cross that line. We don't always know. And that's why I really looked in my book at how are people defining this friendship? Are they calling it a friendship? And that was sort of my key issue there, my key hint as to, and I also looked at various ways that were addressing each other and signing off in letters to figure out how are they shaping at least the face of this relationship. So, they don't have the term friends with benefits in the 18th century. I think that probably happened. That does not seem to be what's happening with Abigail Adams and Thomas Jefferson, right? John Adams is very much a part of this friendship too. And that is part of what makes it safe for them to have the friendship and have it be as close as it is.
But it does kind of beg the question of when can you save the friendship and when can't you, right? So, I mean, Abigail and Jefferson never come back together again, but Abigail and Mercy do. And so I've just been reading those letters for selection in our retirement volumes, that these angry, just absolute, 6-week rant of rage that John Adams goes on when he reads Mercy Otis Warren's history. And every letter he writes to her, more or less so far, he has signed, "Your injured friend." Like, that's a very particular closing line, like to really drive it home in 3 words. But Mercy and Abigail are able to come back together after the death of Mercy's husband, James. And I think that is a really powerful kind of moment, because what brings them back together is not just the loss, but also this kind of shared revolutionary moment that they experience together. Like there's an understanding that there will always be politics, but they were part of something bigger. When they reunite, they trade this incredible jewelry. It's a ring and a brooch that is made of gold, seed pearl, and hair. And it is amazing to see. You can see it here in person and online. And Abigail writes to Mercy that when she looks back on their time together, she says, "We are left gazing like statues." And I think that's such an interesting line because it's women seeing themselves as monuments, as monumental, as part of something bigger that lasts, but also something that could be forgotten. And so I'm just always struck by what these friendships mean to Abigail and John, not just what it says about them, and their political character. It tells us quite a bit of how these networks operated on the ground.
Well, and the hair jewelry piece, I think the brooch also has John's hair in it, right?
Yes.
Abigail puts both of their hair in as a sort of friendship offering among the group of them. So many of these friendships involve at least three people, if not part of a larger group of friends. And, it also points to the fact that I think both then and now we imagine that marriage is the relationship that is going to fulfill all of somebody's emotional needs. And that's not realistic in any time period, right? And I think it's partially because marriage became companionate marriage, that it was supposed to be a friend, that people began to expect more out of it emotionally. But I think what you see is that even people who are happily married in this period have close friendships and close relationships with other family members. That on one hand seems obvious, and on the other hand, when we look at the past, we seem to forget that is happening. And, the people had a whole web of people that they relied on for different needs.
And it's multi-generational, right? Like the Warren kids hang out with the Adams kids. Mercy certainly babysat for Abigail at some point in Milton. I mean, these are just, it's such a long, rich personal history. Not all of it is on display in the archive. So I think being able to tease out that story is just so important.
I have a follow-up question back to the John, Abigail, Thomas Jefferson friendship. Do any of the letters discuss the issue of slavery in America? Did they ever have that conversation through their letters?
So the answer begins and actually takes us back to 1776, when John Adams sends a copy of the Declaration, as the committee originally framed it, home. And certainly it's something Abigail would have seen. It includes a grievance against slavery. It says he has waged cruel war against human nature itself, and goes on to criticize the chattel slavery trade and the trafficking of human beings from one continent to another. We know that Abigail, when she heard the Declaration read from the balcona, as she called it, or the balcony of the old State House here in Boston, noticed that it was missing. And she wrote to John Adams and said that she was sorry that the most manly sentiments had been expunged from the final draft. So certainly this is both a lived reality, right? She meets Sally Hemings.
I was about to say,
comments on that. But
right.
The idea of it is also something that is incredibly present in their conversations, in their letters. Cassie.
Yeah, I assume that Thomas Jefferson knew how the Adams felt about slavery, even if it wasn't always written down, right? We don't have a strong abolition movement in America yet, but John and Abigail Adams are not in favor of slavery, and Thomas Jefferson enslaves quite a large number of people, even though he himself at times expressed that he thought slavery was wrong. And he's the one who wrote that passage, blaming the king for introducing slavery in the colonies, which is kind of strange in certain ways, but it is a critique of slavery. And then, right, this example of when Jefferson sent to have his daughter come over to stay with him in Paris, she was supposed to be bringing along or having take care of her an older enslaved woman who, would take care of her as a young child. that person couldn't come. And so they sent Sally Hemings, who was then like 13. And Abigail Adams, they show up in London. They come to London first before they go to Paris. And Abigail Adams writes and it's like, who is this child you have taking care of your child? And she says some not very complimentary things about Sally Hemings that have some, or they're not, I'm trying to remember, Sarah, if there's anything that is like clearly racist or just sort of an undertone to what she's saying. But, this is actually right before Jefferson and Sally Hemings started their relationship, in which Sally Hemings was apparently pregnant with their first child when they returned to Virginia. So Abigail clearly would have known about this. So I just want to add a little bit of nuance to the relationship, and I'm using air quotes here, between Thomas Jefferson and Sally Hemings, because Sally Hemings is enslaved by Thomas Jefferson. That cannot be a standard relationship in any sense. He has ownership over her body, and she does not have a choice about entering a so-called relationship with him. What we know from Annette Gordon Reed's very careful work, though, is that while they are in Paris and Jefferson, I think, the term we could use here that would be fair and accurate is sexual exploitation, right? I mean, this is a young girl who Jefferson owns. And the fact that she becomes pregnant, she does not have a choice in that. This is an exploitative relationship. However, she seems to have taken the opportunity and realized that she had some negotiating power here, in part because enslaved people in France could become free. So she could have stayed behind and become free. The rest of her family is still in Virginia, other than her brother that's along with them. So it's not obvious that somebody would want to do that in that situation. But her son later recounts that she extracted a promise from Jefferson that any children they had together would be freed. And so to the extent that it is a relationship, it is not purely exploitation. She has, to go back to our term agency, she has a small amount of agency here that she is using as skillfully as possible to create the best situation for her family. And in fact, they have 4 children who survive, and 2 of them are freed outright. And the other 2, Jefferson appears to have just allowed to leave. And we think that they probably passed as white. They may have changed their name. Catherine Carrison's book on Jefferson's daughters, she really tried to hunt down Harriet, the daughter, and could not find her in the archive. But just to say that this is a pretty complicated story here that is hard to grapple with and painful, I think, in a lot of ways. And I would encourage people to go to Monticello and see all of the work they're doing to interpret the Hemings family, to see Sally Hemings' quarters, to see tours about the life of enslaved people at Monticello, because I think there's been so much more done in the past several decades to bring out the humanity of the people that were enslaved there, especially the Hemings family.
One of the things Michon and I encourage people to do is also to go to the places where these sources exist, in addition to reading, etc. And Sara, as you were talking about how you're teasing out from the manuscripts, from the letters, etc., I understand you have a new volume. That's volume 23 of the John Adams papers that's coming out from Harvard University Press. Mm-hmm. Talk about that effort. And what was your editorial process to produce this 23rd volume?
Wow, 23. Oh my goodness, it flies. Okay, so we are in kind of the high tide of John Adams' presidency and correspondence in this period. We selected all 3 presidential volumes at once, so read about 6,000 different manuscripts. And I wish I could tell you that was not the total, but it was in different forms. We select usually about 450 documents to run in each book that really kind of frame the major story. And so each document goes through a pretty discrete process. First, we transcribe it. Then we have a process called collation, where one editor sits with the manuscript and one has the transcription in front of them. And for 3 hours every morning, you kind of read out every bit of every letter with all of the wild, non-standard 18th century punctuation and funny phonetic spellings. It really helps to get John and Abigail's voices in your head that way, I have to say. And you just kind of turn off your spell checker and you go for it. So that is the second step. Then we add some annotation to help describe the people, places, and events in each letter. And then finally, we index the volume. And so the big stories in this volume, we have the Alien and Sedition Acts passed and coming into enforcement. We see a rise in patriotic addresses that are sent to John Adams to support his stance on maintaining peace with France while arming for war. We have the onset of the quasi-war. And then, and this often happens when you're preparing a documentary edition, we have a big story we didn't see coming because the documents tell us so. And so in this book, that story is the Haitian Revolution and the relationship that John Adams builds oh so carefully with Haitian revolutionary Toussaint Louverture in order to figure out the promises of an alliance with a rising Black free republic. And so we have a series of letters that are from Toussaint Louverture that we worked very hard to translate and to kind of frame with our annotation. And that story will continue into Papers of John Adams, Volume 24, the final presidential volume. But there's a very interesting moment there where we are building kind of a three-part alliance between the republic that's rising, Haiti, then Saint-Domingue, and Great Britain suddenly are friends again temporarily, and the United States. So it was fascinating to kind of understand the role of the Caribbean, to understand the role of Haiti in early American foreign policy, and how much it eclipsed so many other things in John Adams' mind. Just when I thought he should be worried about one thing, he was entirely focused on this. And I didn't expect that. There's been so much great new work done about the intellectual and cultural history of the Haitian Revolution. I'm thinking particularly of Ronald Johnson's newest work on entangled alliances. Please go read it. It's so good.
I second that. Yeah.
But there's been so much really exciting work done. You may not think to turn first to the papers of John Adams to look for primary source material on the Haitian Revolution, but it shows how evergreen these founding editorial projects can be in terms of surfacing material for discovery. So it might not be the first obvious stop, but it can be now because we've made it available.
And then, of course, and I'm sure you were thinking about this when you were reading this, that after Adams leaves the presidency and Jefferson comes in, he destroys that whole alliance.
He guts it. He guts it.
Because, as a Southerner and an enslaver, he doesn't want to recognize a successful revolution by enslaved people. And so all that work that John Adams did that you're tracing, we can see doesn't last very long.
No.
Yeah. Well, Cassandra, what's next for you?
My project right now is a women's history project. In between my book on mixed-sex friendships called Founding Friendships and my current project, I also wrote a book called First Family about George Washington's adopted step-grandchildren, the Custis's, whom he raised and who sort of became the celebrity first family in America in the 19th century. And 3 of the 4 of them were women. So I'm writing a lot about women in that book. And, the Adams are in and out of that book. The Custises definitely knew them. There's some inkling that, or at least John Adams tells his daughter-in-law, Louisa Catherine Adams, that he had hoped that George Washington's step-granddaughter, Nellie Custis, would marry John Quincy. Whether he's really being serious or not is not clear. She didn't really know him well. But at any rate, that project is something I actually spent over a decade on. And so I'm just transitioning now into working on women in this period I was talking about before, where campaigning starts, 1840s, looking at women in that period and their political involvement that went beyond campaigning to actual paid lobbying work and other brokering of legislation and political careers. So, in fact, we've had a narrative that by like the 1820s, 1830s, that women's political power in America actually wanes, that the kinds of things that Abigail Adams and other women were doing in early Washington City are not really possible anymore. And I think there's a bit of a lull in the 1830s. But what I'm seeing in the 1840s, 50s, up to the Civil War is so much more direct legislative lobbying involvement of women than I expected. And so that has been really fun to dig into.
Right. So let's remember the women.
Remember the women. Thank you, Sara. Thank you, Cassandra, for joining us on Historical Drama with the Boston Sisters. This has been so enlightening for me and has made John Adams, Abigail Adams, and revolutionary American history or American revolutionary history much more interesting than I was taught.
Thank you.
Thank you. Always great to be in conversation with Sara, too.
Yeah, always fun. We always have a really fun dialogue, and I have like a million follow-up questions about your next project.
You can stream John Adams, the miniseries, on HBO Max and other streaming platforms with a subscription or pay a fee. Also, check your local library. Books mentioned in this podcast are available on the Revolution to Rights America at 250 bookshelf in our affiliate bookstore. That includes Founding Friendships by Cassandra Good, Volume 23 of the John Adams Papers, edited by Sara Georgini, available for pre-order before its release in September 2026, and David McCullough's biography, John Adams, the inspiration for the HBO miniseries. Go to our website at michonbostongroup.com/Boston Sisters to find the link to the affiliate bookstore. Find the webpage for this podcast on our website to download this and other podcasts.
Subscribe to Historical Drama with the Boston Sisters on your favorite podcast platform so you won't miss another episode. We wrap up Season 5 with 2 additional Revolution to Rights America at 250 podcasts. Franklin, the 2024 Apple TV miniseries featuring Michael Douglas as Benjamin Franklin and based on Stacy Schiff's book, A Great Improvisation, Franklin, France, and the Birth of America. And The Book of Negroes, the 2015 Canadian historical drama series based on the novel by Lawrence Hill.
Thank you for catching this episode of Historical Drama with the Boston Sisters. We hope you enjoyed our exploration of captivating historical films and series dramas. Find us on Instagram at Historical Drama Sisters and on Facebook at Historical Drama Boston Sisters.
We want to hear from you. What historical dramas are you watching? Share your favorites. We may feature them in a future episode. Don't forget to subscribe. Visit our website at michonbostongroup.com/Boston Sisters and share the podcast with fellow historical drama enthusiasts.
Historical Drama with the Boston Sisters is brought to you by the Michon Boston Group. The views and opinions expressed on Historical Drama with the Boston Sisters are those of the speakers and do not represent the positions or views of the Michon Boston Group, its clients, or affiliates. This is Michon Boston.
And this is Tequina Boston.
Thank you for listening.